I'm Dr. Scott Lyons, and you're watching or listening to The Gently Used Human. In a world where the pursuit of perfection often becomes a relentless race, have you ever paused to ponder what truly lies at the heart of perfectionism? Is it an internal drive towards excellence, or a mask for our own feelings of unworthiness, a manifestation of internal shame? Today we dive into the intricate maze of perfectionism with Thomas Curran, a world-leading expert on perfectionism and associate professor of Psychological and Behavioural Science at the London School of Economics, to understand how perfectionism affects our mental health and the paradoxical way it blocks our path to genuine success and joy. So whether you've been caught in the snare of self-loathing for not meeting those sky-high goals or simply seeking permission to embrace your beautifully imperfect self, this conversation is for you. Let's get it going. Thomas, welcome to the Gently Used Human. We are so excited to have you here. I am just bubbling with the topic today, and I want to know, as so many of us want to know, how do we be a good enough perfectionist?
Thanks, Scott, for having me. What a question to open with.
No, we're here to talk about perfectionism, which is, you are the world-renowned expert, which I love the idea of, like, the world-renowned expert on perfectionism, and we get to learn all about what it is, why it is, and how to do it better. Hopefully. Yeah. I want to do it better.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm looking forward to our chat. And the opening question there, how do we be a good enough perfectionist? I've never been asked that question before. And frankly, I'm not sure.
well, this is going to go very well, I see. As the world-renowned expert. Yeah. And the first question. No, I'm just kidding. Well, let's start with, like, what is perfectionism?
Okay. Well, phew. I know the answer to that one.
Phew. I might have written a book or two about that.
So, what is perfectionism? Okay, so perfectionism is really important, first and foremost, to differentiate from other things that we often confuse with it. So things like conscientiousness, meticulousness, diligence, that's not perfectionism. Perfectionism starts from a much more defensive place, a place where we're trying to conceal, hide, a place of deficit, I suppose, where we feel like we're not enough, that we're not perfect enough, and that we need to go through the world proving to other people and ourselves that we're worth something, that we matter, that we're loved, if we really want to get the root of it. So perfectionism is really a defense mechanism, is a cloak that conceals a very fragile and imperfect, vulnerable person underneath. And if we start there with perfectionism, we can begin to unpack why perhaps it's not as positive, perhaps, as we think it is.
I feel a little called out right away. Good for you. No, I mean, I appreciate we're already getting to the underlying layers in the first 5 minutes and I really, I hear you. It's like, we can look at it as the symptoms of, like, the obsessiveness, the inability to be flexible, all those things I'm sure you'll talk about. And we know that under the hood of that is actually, it's making up for something. There's as you're saying, like a deficit, a self-esteem issue, a pain. And I know we haven't necessarily even talked about this yet, but I've always associated it with, like, a shame, like perfectionism as, like, the manifestation of internalized shame.
Yeah, it really is. It's shame-based fears of not being enough, essentially.
Yeah.
And I worry that those shameful interiors, those imperfect interiors, those flawed person that we know deep down we really are, because we're all human, and deep down we know that no one is perfect, that we live in fear of, really, of exposing, of people seeing those interiors and then thinking that we're less than, or seeing us or casting us in a negative light. So, look, it's a really, really exhausting, suffocating way to live. It can create a lot of mental health difficulties, and it also can hold us back. It can be a block to performance, a success, contrary to conventional wisdom. So, we really have to start with that deficit thinking to really get to the root and the nub of perfectionism.
Does perfectionism It's an even hard word to say. No, just kidding. Does perfectionism, does it have like a one word definition? Not one word, one sentence definition, or one word? So we know, like, I hear you, like, it's coming from a deficit. We know that that's underneath the hood. But how would, like, if I was talking to my nephew, who's like a 9-year-old, or maybe he's 11 now, who can keep up? But no, he's 11 now. What would be like our definition that's just like super accessible and available for people?
I would say, if you really want to distill it, perfectionism is a problematic relationship with ourselves where we expect too much of ourselves. But it's also a problematic relationship with other people where we expect too much of other people and we, in turn, feel like they expect too much of us. So really, it's, I think in a nutshell, that's how I would describe it.
So it's about this disproportionate expectation from what we take on or what we project in others to what's actually accessible or available to execute. Is that?
Yeah, I think it's really important to add in the social component too, because a lot of people could think, well, it's just about me, but actually, you know, all of those standards, expectations, and the perfect persona we're trying to project into the world is done in a social context. We're doing it for the validation and approval of other people, and so we have to recognise that it isn't just something that impacts us, but that also there are social factors that we feel other people expect us to be perfect, and that we can sometimes inadvertently project our own perfectionism onto other people too. So it's very much a relational as much as it is a personal trait.
It's so interesting as we're starting to really unpack it. And are you a perfectionist? Like, are you a recovering perfectionist? Where are you at in relation to perfectionism?
Oh man, I'm a super perfectionist.
You're a super perfectionist?
Yeah.
You get like 5 perfection stars?
I am on the top end of the spectrum. Although I have to say, I've been doing some good work recently through writing the book, through the experiences that I've been able to reflect on writing the book. It's really helped me release it a little bit, and also putting the book out into the world, I've been able to release my perfection, because you've got no control. Sometimes, you know, you want to control everything when you're a perfectionist. You want to perfect everything. You can't do that when you put a book out into the world. So, or anything of yourself into the world. You can't control how other people are going to respond. So yeah, I definitely would consider myself a perfectionist. Why I do the work? It's one of the reasons I did the research in the first place, because perfectionism really took over in my late 20s. I had some big problems. So it's a personal curiosity, but it isn't just that. I saw perfectionism everywhere. I mean, you only got to look outside the front door and you'll see perfectionism all over the place. So I really wanted to understand it, not just as an individual perspective, but also as a broader societal perspective, because this is very much the modern zeitgeist.
Yeah. How did you recognize it in yourself? I mean, it's, you know, often when we have such a strong driver like perfectionism or like addiction, you know, one of the main symptoms is that we often don't recognize it. We believe it to be the absolute truth. So how did you even recognize it?
Well, that's a very common among perfectionist people. They wouldn't consider themselves to be perfectionists, or they wouldn't think that they've necessarily got perfectionistic traits. I think for myself, it took a long while to see that what was driving me to do unhealthy things, you know, working evenings, weekends, writing my dissertation on Christmas Day, all these sort of really unhealthy things were part of a perfectionistic mindset, which is telling me to continually do more, be more, try to lift yourself above others at all times, improve yourself and justify your existence all the time. And the other thing about perfection is really curious is that those behaviors you think are the things that are holding you up in the world. Mm-hmm. Those are the things you're holding really tight to you because you don't want to let them go. You think that everything else could be crashing down. Relationships could be breaking up. You could have health scares or family or relational issues. It could be things that are going on outside you that are really creating a lot of stress. And you think, but at least I got my perfectionism. At least I got my perfectionism that's going to push me forward. It's going to make me successful. And the realization for me was that actually it's perfectionism that exacerbates those stresses. It takes those stresses, it squeezes them into all spheres of our lives. It makes us repress the difficulty that we're having under the guise and the cloak of perfectionism, that hyper function, but we're just going to keep pushing ourselves forward. That's the one thing that's going to get me through this, when actually it's the one thing that's going to prolong it and make it worse. And I think that was the real turning point for me, when I realized that, you know, perfectionism wasn't something that, you know, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, this kind of mantra. It wasn't this Cape Crusader, but there was actually something that I needed to get on top of, because it was having a tremendously negative impact on my mental health.
So you recognized it in this way because you were pushing and pushing and pushing. And was there ever a point that you were like, I've achieved, or this is good? Or is the push, like, does it override that capacity to absorb the completion or the satisfaction of anything?
Well, absolutely not. I mean, perfectionism is the thief of joy. Because you can never feel satisfied if you have perfectionism. There's always something more to do. The better you do, the better you feel like you're expected to do. It's like chasing the horizon. The closer you think you're getting, the further it moves. There's always something more. There's always another goal to strive for. And it's what you have in this moment, the achievements that you've accomplished in the moment matter far less than what you need to do in the future. And that just steals contentment. Like, it's an inability to reflect on the the pride in something that you've done that's been successful, or that you've made it a certain distance, and that should be normally really something you should be really proud of, but you're not allowed to stop and savor. You have to continue to crave. And that really is the difficulty of being a perfectionist, because that's the trap of perfectionism, in essence, that no achievement is good enough. But on top of that, there's also the flip side, because when we do encounter setbacks and difficulties, perfectionism makes us intently self-conscious about those setbacks and can create a lot of self-criticism and self-loathing. Like, how could you be so stupid? What were you thinking? You have a certain standard. You didn't meet it. There must have been something wrong. You can really go in on yourself. So not only do you not feel joy when you've done some things well, but you're really scathing when you've done some things not so well. And that's just, it's such an exhausting, difficult way to live when there's no space to be content and find joy.
It is the antithesis of, I mean, I love what you said. It's a thief of joy. That's so resonant. And it's like, ooh, I think those of us who are listening to this right now can even ask ourselves, why might there not be more joy in my life? And to step back and say, could perfectionism be a contribution to that? That's huge. That's really big.
Yeah, and I think it's so important that people recognize that perfectionism is something that, rather than holding us up, is something that can have a major impact on our well-being. Because joy is what life is about, essentially. I mean, if you've ever been in an intimate moment with someone else and you realize you love them for the first time and nothing else matters around you, and that's the only thing that's going on right at that moment, that's joy, right? And in this world, we experience so little of those moments. They feel so fleeting, and it's not that you can experience unparalleled joy all the time. That would be crazy. I think the goal really to overcome perfectionism is really to encounter those moments in ever more regularity, and to not let perfectionism block those moments, and to allow ourselves to live freely inside all of ourselves, with all our feelings and all of our emotions, unencumbered, I suppose, by that worry about what other people think. That's our challenge anyway.
So you mentioned, there was a breaking point in your 20s, was it? That where the driver of perfectionism, like what happened? It toppled over your mental health, and in what way?
Panic attacks, really, really severe panic attacks, depression, listlessness, fatigue. One of the things that's not talked about very often when it comes to anxiety is how tired and exhausting it is, and how it just completely saps all of your energy, and then that impacts on your functioning and your productivity, and that can then lead, in a feedback loop back to the anxiety, and all, so you start to really descend very quickly once you're on that path. And that certainly was the case for me. And it was kind of there was at one point I remember thinking, am I ever going to feel normal again? Like, I'm ever going to feel energetic again? I'm ever going to feel okay again? Like, I really questioned. I thought this was just a new reality. And then I sought help. And that's, when you're in that cycle, it's really, really important to break it by seeking help, by talking to people. Your perfectionism will tell you, repress it. Don't tell anyone. Maintain this perfect facade of hyperfunction, that you are a hyperfunctional person. You don't need help. But the truth is that sometimes you do, and it's really important to break that cycle of self-sabotage, anxiety, low mood by addressing it. And once I was able to do that, I took a bit of time off. I reset myself. I actually quit my job and moved back home because I was in Australia at the time. And then I started to build back up, but with a different mindset, the more philosophical, reflective mindset where, what will be, and to try to let life happen a little bit more rather than trying to perfect everything all around me. And what's interesting is not only has that been very good for my perfectionism, but it's also been very good for my career too. I've been able to think more imaginatively, outside the box, take risks, do things that I definitely wouldn't have done before, and that's helped me. So, I think it's a really important lesson, and this is borne out in the data as well, that perfectionism isn't necessary for success, that actually there are way more healthier ways to strive, and we'll become way more productive with a lot less psychological worries and anxieties. And so I think it's time to rethink perfectionism and maybe choose a different direction instead.
Yeah. I mean, I appreciate that. And thank you for sharing your story. I mean, first of all, I think so many people can relate to it to some degree, of going, those panic attacks, that feeling of needing to do this, to needing to perform, the urgency of it, and maybe meeting those expectations or not meeting those expectations, either spiraling into more shame or spiraling into burnout.
Yeah.
And, and either in any pathway doesn't lead to really what you're saying, like creativity. It doesn't lead to a place of actual performance, high performance execution.
Yeah.
And that's the shit of it, frankly. Like it says, like, if you keep pushing, you will achieve.
Yeah.
But what you actually achieve is dis-ease.
Yeah, you end up in a really difficult place. I think there's an argument to suggest that perfectionism can, in the short term, boost performance. Certainly, in my case, that's probably right, but it's not sustainable. Look, it's just not sustainable in the long term. You are going to burn out, as you mentioned, and it is going to feel really shitty. It's such important to break through that conventional wisdom that perfectionism is a favorite flaw. It's the necessary evil. We know it has this baggage, but it helps us be more successful. The data doesn't show that. My experience doesn't show that. Many people's experiences doesn't show that. The data is clear. It's not helping us. And that, conscientiousness, meticulous diligence, all these things are wonderful. Okay. They're and very, should be encouraged, but not perfectionism.
Yeah. I heard you say on an interview that in like when people are doing job interviews and they're asked, like, what is it? Like, what's your worst trait, or what trait are you like, what's your biggest flaw? And people will say perfectionism, as like, and I understand why. It's like, then the manager were like, oh, this person will work really hard. And I would laughed at it when I heard that, because I was like, oh, I would never hire someone who gave that answer. But maybe that's because we're psychologists, or, we studied psychology, and we know there's some baggage that comes with that.
Yeah, absolutely. But it is the most overused cliche in job interviews. Recruiters tell us that all the time. It's something that employees or prospective employees say. Yeah. But I do understand it. Like you say, I completely understand it. We live in a hyper-competitive world. Yeah. We don't think that employees are looking for anything less than perfection.
And it's true.
Yeah, it is true.
I mean, I say, like, I wouldn't hire someone, but I will be honest, I also really appreciate someone who really has that drive. Like, we'll try to achieve a high level. So how do we achieve a high level without the baggage that comes maybe from the deficit?
Well, I think we've got to switch up a little bit. I think we've got to reframe perfectionism. Perfectionistic people will think very black and white. I've got to do this. I must do that. I have to work this hard, and if I don't, something catastrophic is going to happen. Right? That's the deficit that hides behind these drives. I think it's so important not to repress those thoughts and feelings, but actually let them in. And maybe, I don't know if it's helpful to diary or just write them down. But I think it's so important to reflect on how much you actually believe that, first and foremost. How much do I actually believe that if I don't do X, the world's going to come crashing down? Like, do I actually believe that? Or actually is the reality something a little bit softer, right? Like that, it might not be comfortable, but at the same time, it's not going to be a disaster, right? And you can start to reframe those beliefs as a little bit softer, a little bit more compassionate, and encourage yourself then to take the onus and say, okay, well, let's just push myself out there. If I've convinced myself it's not going to be a catastrophic thing, then put my hand up for doing that talk, or put my hand up for leading that project, or do you know what I mean? Or doing that hobby, baking that recipe, or putting on an evening for my friends, or whatever it might be that you feel uncomfortable doing, right? Just put yourself out there, challenge your perfectionism in that way. And as you do that, you will feel uncomfortable and it will be difficult, but at the same time, you can learn a lot about yourself, and you can learn a lot about the perfectionism and the perfect person you're trying to emulate, because it's essentially for many, many years you were living in fear of that person. But by putting yourself out there and doing these things, you can recognize that person is not worth living in fear for at all. And the consequences aren't nearly as catastrophic as we think they are. So I think it's so important to be a little bit brave, to push yourself a little bit, to be vulnerable and accept that it's going to be uncomfortable, but it's okay. And be kind to yourself. I mean, I know it's a cliche, I do recognize that, but it's so, so important. If you are going to push yourself a little bit, you're going to put yourself in situations where you might make mistakes. You've got to be kind to yourself and to other people in those situations too. So kindness, I think, is a very, very big antidote to perfectionism. And see this as a journey, by the way, not as a destination. I don't think you'll ever eradicate your perfectionism totally. That's not really the goal. The goal is to just move ourselves a little bit further backwards on the spectrum. And we can do that by being vulnerable and push ourselves out of our comfort zone a little.
Yeah. I love that. I mean, there's gold nuggets in all of that. I had this image in my head of like the perfectionist hearing all of this and being like, I'm gonna do the best version of challenging perfection. You know what I mean? I mean,
exactly what you mean. That's your initial question on this whole.
I'm gonna crush this. I'm gonna fucking crush anti-perfectionism.
Yeah. It's so true. But that is the kind of self-help in a nutshell. It's what you should do. You should be doing this. You should be doing yoga. You should be doing Pilates. You should be doing meditation. This is what Curran talked about. He talked about tyrannies of should. When you embark on any rehabilitative journey from psychological difficulties, it's so important to make sure that they're fully integrated, that what you're doing aligns with how you want to live, right? And what's true to you, and it shouldn't come from a place of, okay, well, in order to get over this, whatever it is I'm thinking about, I have to do X, Y, and Z, right? That's not the way to think about recovery. What's more important is that you find your you find your why, you find your purpose, and then you do everything that you can to move yourself in that direction. And that's why I say being vulnerable, pushing yourself a little bit, so important. But the direction in which you push yourself must be aligned with what's valuable to you and what chimes with your own passions and interests.
Yeah. I want to take a moment to give a loud shout out to the Embody Lab, which is one of the most incredible resources for body-based and somatic therapies. This show is all about healing, and the Embody Lab does exactly that. Whether you're on your own journey of transformation and discovery, or enhancing your skill sets in your career as like a coach or a therapist, a body worker, or really any career where you are supporting other gently used humans, the Embody Lab is your place for deep, inspiring, and impactful workshops, certificates, masterclasses, and an incredible community of like-minded folks. I love the Embody Lab, and so do so many other people that call it a platform to come home to over and over again. The Embody Lab is giving my listeners an exclusive offer, a one-time 10% off code to enhance your embodied well-being. All you have to do is go to theembodylab.com and use the code GentlyUse10 at checkout. So you've talked about, challenging reality, or the perception of reality, of going, okay, if this isn't perfect, is it actually the end of the world? Or what are the consequences, if any? Maybe I wouldn't get 5 gold stars. I might get 4 gold stars on my spelling test. If it, or if I don't get all A's, I will still be able to go to college, or whatever it is that we have built up, sort of recognizing and challenging the narrative we built up around the idea of, if we don't do this, then this.
That goes back to the idea that perfectionism is the block to progress. Mm-hmm. So that catastrophization is really just an excuse to stop us moving forward. And so that's big, that's the big roadblock to try to overcome, which is why softening those beliefs, reframing those beliefs is so crucial. And by the way, it's also linked to things like procrastination and avoidance, which perfectionistic people do a lot. When they're encountering really challenging tasks or things that might ultimately end in failure, we'll avoid those things. And we see this in the lab all the time. So it's not just about reframing, it's also about giving yourself specific blocks of time to get started on activities. Turn everything off, turn all distractions off, phone, internet, whatever it is, and just give yourself a certain amount of time to get things started. So it's not just about putting stuff out into the world, letting things go. It's also about removing the block to starting projects and assignments and presentations too. That's also important for perfectionism.
That's so interesting. I never really correlated that, where those who are trying to be high achievers are also easily distracted or procrastinators.
Yeah, but but it goes back to that self-sabotaging nature of perfectionists, that they feel it's an anxiety management strategy, essentially, to remove ourselves from what's really difficult in that moment and do anything else, to avoid it. And we really, that's the biggest block to progress. And so we have to really hone in on that when it comes to challenging our perfectionism and break through it in ways that can feel quite brutish at first. What I'm saying is turn everything off, remove all distractions, and just get something done. That sounds quite extreme, but it's so important as a starting point, because we know that if perfectionistic people start, they're way, way, way more likely to finish. So just getting things started is so important. And as I say, giving yourself set amounts of time, being very strict with yourself and removing distractions is the best way to do that.
So that's one aspect of perfectionism. Let's say, as it relates to other areas like the body, of this idea of the perfect body, or which we see it then lead to things like orthorexia and over exercising. So how, and I hear you. It's how do we start to? It's so interesting, because it's not like you don't want to necessarily start poking holes in someone's construction of their ego, but you want them to start to become more tolerable to the human flaw, or the flaws that are just part of human, or the things that aren't, absolute. So what would someone do? Let's go through different incarnations of perfectionism. So perfectionism of the body. How would we work with someone in that regard?
I mean, so first and foremost, I have to preface this by saying I'm not a clinician, so it's really, really important to stress that. But what I do know from the literature is that what we see in perfectionism behavior is a very warped sense of what's normal and what's desirable and obtainable, and often those things are out of line with reality. And that doesn't just mean, we've talked about work, we could talk about sports too, but it also applies to these kind of exercise image related domains. Everybody's different. Nobody's perfect, as you mentioned. And if we try and sculpt, perfect, airbrush and all the rest of it, our lives to some perfect existence, what we do is we lose something of ourselves. Mm-hmm. And I think it's so important when you feel like that's happening, that there is a big disconnect between the person that you're trying to emulate and who you really are, and that's having a major tension internally. You feel rubbish about yourself because you're not meeting those expectations, then that can unfold and manifest itself in a lot of obsessive tendencies around exercise, diet, and all the rest of it. The real key in order to turn the corner on those tendencies is to try to reconnect with ourselves, to accept that, we are imperfect, we are flawed, and everybody in some way lives an imperfect life, and that's okay. And that there's actually some joy in embracing those imperfections and differences about, who we are and what we look like. And I think if we can accept that, and if we can accept ourselves on those terms, then the power of those pressures to conform to some kind of idea just melt away, and that we're able to live more contentedly inside our own lives with our own flaws and our own foibles. So, that's really on a very broad level what's important, and that requires a lot of introspection, of course, a lot of reflection, a lot of reframing some of the strategies that we've talked about. But it really is important, first and foremost, to recognize that we're all different and we're all imperfect, and that's okay. That's the enlivening part of life, really, and we should be embracing those things rather than trying to exercise them or airbrush them out of existence.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting thing, because we can get to the point where we can say, "Oh, I'm a gently used human," or I'm a human, and I'm not perfect, but then there's like the actual work, and I think about that as like, how do we then embody that vulnerability that we're talking about here? Because like, it's one thing to cognitively recite it. It's another thing to actually feel it and believe it, of going, oh, I think of an example of like, oh, I cooked dinner for a bunch of friends the other night, and then frankly, it wasn't that great. But they were still enjoying it, and we still had a great evening. And so I think about like those moments where it's like, we could shame ourselves, or we could try to be like, at one point I said I would remake the dinner if they wanted. And they were like, no, it's great. It's fine. It's good enough. It's not burnt. Good for you. And
that's exactly the feedback you want, isn't it?
I was like, oh, no, I want it to be the best fucking meal you've ever had. And I've never gone to school for cooking. So, there's that. But it's like taking that time in to be like, oh, they still love me. Like, they're still here. And to actually like pause and take that in. It's like, oh, I'm not the best cook. I'm not, like, it's not, and that's okay. And we're also okay. And there's an okayness here. And can I again pause and just like take that in? Like, the world is okay. What does that feel like? This relationship is okay. What's that like? The food is okay. And what does that taste like? Like really taking it in, as opposed to just like repeating a mantra at myself of like, the world's okay, flaws are okay. You know what I mean? Of like, how do we really embody it?
Well, it's not easy, and you got to embrace the journey. And also, it's really interesting you bring up that anecdote, because that's like, I just feel that a lot, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners will feel that. Like, it's really hard in this culture, isn't it, to do something that you're not world champion at, because everyone's putting on these soirees, fancy dinner parties, and it feels like that's the level, right? And it's really important to do exactly as you're saying, to recognize that sometimes you're not world champion at everything. That's okay, and that what's most important is that you find joy and purpose in those things. The meal is important, yes, but what's more important is the camaraderie, like the company, the conversation, the connection that you have with other human beings. Like that's really what makes us a human and gives us joy. Those are the things. The meal, if the meal was amazing, that would be great. Yeah, but if the meal is good enough, that's also great. Like, it's not about the outcome. It's not about what's produced, but more about the process and the fact that we tried. We did something, we put something on, and that's really important. And I think that goes for everything, by the way, hobbies, whatever. If you suck at something, I suck at playing guitar, for example, but it brings me joy. And my perfectionism would stop me doing that year after year after year. But now, once I've started to be able to let things go a little bit more and recognize that the joy is the most important thing, not the act, then you can begin to immerse yourself in those experiences. And that's, that's what it's about, really. So, I don't pretend it's easy. I don't have a quick fix life hack. Here's 5 top tips, go away and do them. It's more about reconnecting with ourselves and a wholehearted commitment, I suppose, to living inside all of ourselves, with all of our feelings, all our emotions, with our friends and families, and experiencing the, a common humanity. And I think that's the most important thing. And it's certainly helped me, focus on the important things in life has certainly helped me overcome perfectionism.
I appreciate that. And I also appreciate you saying, I don't have the top, here are the top 5 things that hack you out of perfectionism, because that is a manifestation of perfectionism in our culture.
Yeah.
I get those same kind of questions. What are the top 5 ways to do this? And I was like, I don't know. Because every human is different. And and this idea of it being exact and the absolute and this is the hack just feels like a projection of that urgency and that not enoughness and that it has to be shaped and perfected in a way that is sellable.
Yeah. Well, you're really getting at the nub here of the cultural angle on perfectionism that I tried to take in the book, because a lot of this is societal, is systemic. We feel this way because we're supposed to feel this way at some level. We're supposed to doubt ourselves. We're supposed to feel like we need to be more, we need to have more, do more, work more, because that's what keeps the economy going. And of course, if we didn't feel those things, our economy would really struggle in short order. And one of the things I see a lot is people recommend, contentedness and believing in yourself and feeling, and feeling that you are good enough. These are really important things to feel. They are really good, important things to feel. Because if everyone started doing that, we would have big problems. So this is very circular in some ways, and we have to be aware of that context. Yeah. Because that takes a lot of personal power for ourselves. Actually, the kind of system depends on this to a certain extent. And actually, I'm supposed to feel this way. So there's nothing wrong with me. That actually, this is just part and parcel of the society I live in. And I think there's something quite powerful just about that understanding and that recognition alone.
Yeah. Yeah. Because we could also say perfectionism is about these unrealistic expectations of ourselves. But where are those expectations coming from? They don't just develop and grow like a fungus inside of us out of nowhere.
Exactly.
They're not a virus. In hypnotism, we talk about thought viruses. Right. And we say, where is the origin of that infection, or where is the origin of that virus? And so I think it's really important to recognize okay, we might have internalized those expectations, but from where? Whose voice is that's really announcing that drive and pushing that drive?
Yeah, it's so important. Actually, we talk about that because you're absolutely right. We talk about these societal problems, mental health crises, social media, and parenting practices that are changing in the workplace and all this stuff, as kind of interesting happenstances. Oh, that's an interesting thing. Let's look at that. Oh, there's another interesting thing. Let's look at that. Well, actually, what we don't do is try to connect the dots. I recognize that all these things are linked at a basic level, and they're linked by living inside an economy that needs to grow way more than we need to feel content. And look, there's nothing, I don't put a value judgment on that. I'm not going to come here and get all political. All I'm saying is that is just the way it works.
Don't be shy.
But that's just the way it works, right? Yeah. Good or bad, whatever. I'm not going to get into that, but that is just how it works. And that's where if at its most basic root level is where those voices are coming from. It's that push to continually do more that makes us feel like we're constantly not enough, that we have to be updating our lives all the time, and that we have to feel, dependent on other people's validation and approval for a sense of self-esteem in ourselves, which, social media companies take advantage of through the algorithms, which, advertisers take advantage of us through, just seeding those little holes of doubt that then they fill with a material product. All of these things that go on all around us on an everyday basis, almost a minute by minute basis, when you think of smartphones and how ubiquitous they are things we just can't escape. And those are little voices that are coming at us all the time. And I think we just need to be aware of that. I think awareness is so important when it comes to our perfectionism, because if we can wrap our head around the fact that this in some way is the way that we're supposed to feel, then that takes so much power off this idea that there's something wrong with me, if that makes sense.
You better preach about that perfectionism. You better preach, son. Yeah. I mean, I appreciate you deconstructing it like that. And like, if perfectionism is representative of the void within us and the deficits within us, and we recognize absolutely people are going to capitalize on that and say like, ooh, there's something to hook into. So let's do it, because that captures and maintains your attention, which is the driver of an economy.
Yeah.
The driver of capitalism.
Yeah.
Like, it's not political. It's just what it is. That's how marketing works.
Exactly.
Take a marketing class. That's how it works. Like, I took a marketing class. That's how it works. And it's like, I think about, to go back to like the thought viruses too. It's like, awareness is so important because it is coming at us. We can't necessarily stop it.
Yeah.
Like, we're not going to stop social media. We're not going to stop our parents and their high expectations of us. We're not going to stop the expectations of work, of what like the achievement markers are. So it's really about having a conversation with what's coming at us and saying, what do we want to absorb and where can we find the antidote, it sounds like, to this, which is keep connecting to the things that give you purpose and joy.
Oh, that's so true. That's exactly it. And in some ways it's a kind of rejection of what you're told you should be doing, and rather trying to find your purpose within that word. And look, if what gives you purpose and meaning is to go out and, go on holidays, buy cars, whatever, like, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But it's got to come from, as you mentioned, a place of purpose and meaning. Because if it comes from a place of external validation and approval, then you need to look a certain way or behave a certain way, then that's perfectionism. That's trying to be somebody else, somebody perfect. And that's where the discomfort comes from, in essence.
Yeah. I think about like some of the ways, like the radical ways, especially when I was younger, of exploring imperfection, like taking classes where you stand in front of a mirror naked and saying like, I accept this. And like, like I come from a more experimental, radical background, and, like the realization or the sort of 1960s version of therapy sometimes, like Esalen and those wild folks. But yeah, I remember I was working with a CEO a couple of years ago. I work a lot with very, people with a lot of perfectionism, because they're in roles where they have a lot of pressure to execute at a very high level. And I made him play tag with me in his office at work. And he was like, but people will see. And I was like, well, let's see what would happen. And then like what ended up happening is people like came up to him afterwards, because they could see through the glass door, and they're like, it's so great to know how playful you are. Like that gives me a sense that I can breathe.
Yes. That's great.
And I just like playing tag. So,
So added bonus.
It's an added bonus.
Yeah. But you know what though? There's a really important lesson there, because there is something very humanizing about when you break down this facade, right? Yeah. This, and you realize that actually you're not bulletproof, that you are imperfect, you are vulnerable, and you have a playful side that doesn't necessarily conform to this professional persona. Yeah. And you think that's going to be incredibly revealing to other people. You think that they're going to be judged for that, but actually there's something intimately humanized about it that people could recognize in themselves. And it brings you closer to other people when you show that vulnerability, not further away. I think that's a wonderful, it's a very funny anecdote, but I think that's a wonderful example actually of like the reaction is not what you expect it to be, because I think it's something very connecting about those moments where the facade is shattered and you find out, the real person underneath. Yeah. I think we all want to see that.
Yeah. In fact, those types of things where finding play again were much more effective for me than standing in front of a mirror naked. Like I was just like, okay, I'm naked. There's my stuff. It is what, like, I don't know. I would still like to work out more. And I can keep repeating this idea, like this mantra of like, you're good enough, you're good enough. But it couldn't be embodied. Like it was just like something I was saying at myself in the same way I couldn't absorb it more than I could absorb all the other people's expectations and then my own expectations on myself as a projection of what other people might be thinking.
Yeah, I love it. I love that. And it is true. It has to be embodied. It has to. Otherwise, it doesn't mean anything. You know, it's one thing to say these things. It's always so hard, actually, to communicate. Because I get asked these questions a lot. So, like, what do you need to do? What's your tips and all the rest of it? Yeah. And it's really hard to communicate that this isn't just like, you can't just get this.
You can't perfect anti-perfectionism.
Like you really have to let it sink in and take time, and that's not going to happen overnight. That won't even happen over a month or whatever. It could happen over years. It's a journey of self-discovery, of accepting who we are, and those are small baby steps. You know that really are. It's really difficult. What I'm saying, it's really difficult to like say in a snapshot, 5 minute snippet. Here you go. Here's what to do. Yeah. It's bigger than that.
It is bigger than that. It has a longer history than that. You know, I'm assuming if there's been some type of deficit experience, it didn't just start yesterday. You know, whether it was quote unquote failures, and I want to come back to that word, but quote unquote failures or mishaps in our life, or moments where we didn't achieve someone else's expectations, and we have this sort of like frozenness in our body that can lead up to this greater sense of like, I'll never let that happen again, or I'll never be in that position again where that type of shame was felt, or that type of disapproval was felt. But it doesn't just happen overnight. It is, as I'm hearing, and I remember from the research as well that you've done, like it is a progressive thing. I don't want to call it a syndrome. Progressive experience.
Yeah, it's a journey, you know. And actually, the purpose is embarking on the journey, being brave enough to take the first steps in a different direction. Like that's the hardest, most courageous, boldest thing you can do. A lot of people focus their mind on the end point. Yeah. But I'm not even sure there is an end. But like, you can never fully accept yourself. I don't think that's ever possible. But you can certainly get closer to who you are by taking, by moving in a different direction. And that it's really about the journey towards it rather than the end point, if that makes sense. And so it's really difficult then when you get asked, well, how do we get to this end point, to then communicate? But it's not really about it's much more about just turning in a different direction and taking small steps in a very uneven path as well, by the way. There's going to be times where we succumb to the pressures, and that's okay. You know, it's not a linear trajectory either. But as long as we can put ourselves in the right direction, that's the most important thing.
Yeah. I love that, by the way. And if like we make it about the end point, then we're just replicating the ideologies of perfectionism.
Yeah.
Like, I will achieve again this healing, and I will get it done in this way, and it will be absolute. This show is also brought to you by the absolutely stunning and powerful tools of transformation that are created by Omala. Oof, even the name Omala transports you to a place of flow and vitality. These are some of my favorite products ever. They have an amazing color-changing yoga mat that responds to your temperature and presence and reflects back your posture in real time. There's this incredible smelling skin balm candle that heats up to activate all the essential oils and vitamins that your skin has been craving. I mean, look, if I could live in a giant bath of this candle, I would 100% do it. They also have these journals that lead you into profound insight, and then you get to plant those journals to create a stunning flower garden. What? I mean, if that's not deep and inventive, I don't know what is. If you're someone who desires to live a luxurious flow of life and who believes in transformative wellness, then you have to check out Omala. Omala is giving my listeners an exclusive discount to treat yourself to something that is as special as you, boo. All you have to do is go to omala.com, that's OMALA.com, and use the code DrScott10 at checkout. And a portion of every purchase goes to an incredible charity. You got this. Yeah, I think that there's something really interesting in the wellness field, which is like, okay, there's been a real uptake, people attending to, listening to, reading about like attachment theory.
Right.
And okay, so like, all right, so now because of what happened in my childhood, I have a particular stance, and that reflects in my current relationships to myself and other people.
Mm.
And there's this idea of that now more than I feel like ever is about like, we should have had the perfect parent. Yeah. And so like, oof, that's like, I'm not a parent. I'm a dog dad, but like, and you know, there's a lot of pressure there, but like, there's so much pressure on parents because of, as we recognize the consequences of not having certain qualities in our childhood. Now there's this like, talk about it.
Scott, do you know what? Thank you for saying this, because this is like a breath of fresh air. I feel so released because what you're saying is things that I've just thought a lot about, but it's difficult to distill them into such a coherent way as you've just done there. But you're absolutely right. You know, these emphases that we place on having the correct upbringing and making sure that we don't foster that insecure attachment, and you know, we're doing these things and we're giving love, support, and all the rest of it. Like, it kind of inculcates a sense we've got to be the perfect parent.
Yeah.
And that Donald Winnicott talked very persuasively in the 1950s. I think it was about the imperfect mother.
Yeah.
And basically, his argument, which still stands today, we've forgotten about it, but it still stands today, is that there's no such thing as a perfect parent, first and foremost. Doesn't exist. But secondly, you didn't want to be the perfect parent anyway, because what you have is a situation where you will teach young people that there's no room for errors. They'll become hypersensitive to your worries and the mistakes that you think you're making. And that also the world is a messy place. It's chaotic. It's unpredictable. They have to experience some of the shit, like a little bit of it. Do you know what I mean? So that they're prepared to go into a world where they'll experience even more of the shit. Yeah. So it's not even optimal to try to be the perfect parent. And I think that you can have overriding philosophies which are extremely healthy. The biggest one being consistency of love and approval. That's so important. Don't qualify that love and approval. Just love kids all the time. Keep loving them no matter what happens. It's so important. And you can teach them also by example. You know, failure and mistakes and the rest of it are very humanizing, not humiliating. Talk about them, laugh about them, humanize them. You can have so these broad kind of philosophies which I think are really important, but in essence, don't try to perfect everything and worry about every little message or word that you're saying is going to inculcate some kind of stress or anxiety or insecure attachment, but actually rather just live and exist and enjoy the joy of being a parent and and the frustrations and the stresses and strains that come with it. Just go along with the ride. That is the most important thing about being a parent, in my opinion, not worrying about how to do it 100% correctly.
Yeah, I have a dear friend who, bless her heart, like grew up in a really painful environment, like a lot of drugs, a lot of absence, and you know, she's from my hometown. We're still like childhood friends, and like she was talking to me about all this stuff and like couldn't let the baby down and she would call me because I used to work in pediatrics, and she'd be like, okay, I know that this is the best way to pick up the baby, so I don't startle them, but I didn't do it. So how do I go back? And, you know, and it was like this anxiety that was the driver. And I was like, hey, love, in this idea of trying to correct what you didn't have, can you hear the intensity in your voice? She's like, oh, yeah, I can hear it now that you reflected. I was like, can you feel the intensity in your body? She's like, yeah. And I was like, the idea that you hold so strongly to is that you want to be present in a way that your caregivers weren't present for you. And I was like, all you got to do is come back in your body, be here. That's huge. That's so big. And the anxiety of being present, of having to be perfect in your presence, is taking you out of that presence. And it was it's still a learning process for her, as it is for all of us, but it was a big revelation of her just wanting to do so much better than what she got.
Yeah, and it's totally understandable, and it's completely natural. And I have so much empathy for parents these days, because it doesn't matter what you do, you're always going to do.
You're going to fuck up your kids. They're going to hate you.
and also, but Scott, can I also say something really provocative? I'm sure it's going to sound that way, but I don't think that we have that much control over the way our kids turn out anyway. If you look at the data, most of it's genetics, which is huge, right? So you can't do anything about that. It's about half the way we turn out is genetic. And then what's the rest of it is learned mostly, not always, all of it, but mostly in the broader environment, outside of the household, with our peer groups and our friends. I had two parents with different accents. Did I take on their accent? Did I take on the accent of the world around me? Of course I took on the accent of the world around me, the people that I was, because they were the most proximal influences on my character development. And that goes for social media. You throw social media into it, and even more so, so I think also that sounds like, I've got no control, but that can be also quite liberating in some ways. It can be a great deal of comfort there that our control is limited in that way. Do you know what I mean? And I think that can take a lot of pressure off too, to recognize that, all we can do is provide a warm, safe, and comforting home environment that has plenty of love and all the rest of it. Those are very crucial things. But beyond that, our control is quite limited, and I think sometimes there's something comforting there.
I mean, I imagine why for a lot of people, or enough people, why things like AA are helpful, because you work towards being with the helplessness. And that is part of life is not necessarily the helplessness. It's really about the acceptance here. What we're talking about is acceptance that we're not in control, which can be framed a little bit as a fine helplessness, an innate human helplessness, which is the world is chaos, and the more we try to grasp onto it, the more suffering we experience.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we try to, we're doing our best within that and trying to, I'm just to go back to the parent thing more specifically, the Godman Institute.
Yeah.
And they talk about good enough parenting. And I love that because they're backing it up with research that says if you can show up for 33% of the time, 1/3 of the time, if you can be present, emotionally available, and all the components that lend itself to secure attachment, then guess what? You've done a good enough job for them to feel to have a secure attachment.
Yeah.
And it's that, when I read that, I was like, whoa, 33% of the time? That's it? I was mad at first, personally. I was like, no, it should be 90% of the time. But it's hard to argue with that amount of research.
Yeah, and I mean, I completely agree with the philosophy. I think it's so, if we become overly anxious about rearing, then children will see that they're very impressionable creatures, and if we're worried about making mistakes in our parenting, they're going to worry about making mistakes in their own lives, because that's how they see their parents interacting with difficulty and setback with anxiety. And so, it is about creating a broad philosophy and a broad environment of love and emotional support and all the rest of it, and giving as much time and all the rest of it to our kids, but not worrying so much about it being 100% perfect. And like you say, 33% good enough. I don't know what even 33% means in terms of practical, but I get the broad philosophy that it doesn't have to be all the time.
Yeah, when I was doing my dissertation and I wasn't available for my dogs, and this was, and I felt I went to many therapy sessions being like, I just feel like am failing as a dog dad. And I just like the guilt was so strong. And then this was about the same time I had come across the research on 33%. And it was like, all right, well, if I can dedicate at least 33% of the time, maybe I can resolve some of my guilt, which is actually stopping me from being more engaged with them. Like, I'm shaming myself, and the shame is like perpetuating the freeze and not actually helping me be a better available dog dad. I can't believe I'm spending this episode talking about being a dog dad. I'm sure that others can relate, whether you have kids or a pet.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's the permission, isn't it? It's the permission to just know that it's okay that I can't be available there 100% of the time. And not to feel guilty about that, to know that there are other aspects of our lives that also need nourishment, and to know that there are aspects of our lives that also we need just to do, to go to work, to see people, These are things on top of our responsibilities. Just giving ourselves permission to be able to do those things is, I think, really important.
Yeah. Now I'm going to bring up something not controversial, but a little like pushy against that, because it's like, now, if any of our partners only showed up for 33% of the time, I mean, like that wouldn't feel like enough. Like as an adult, like if my partner was only available 33% of the time, I'd be like, and goodbye. I mean, granted, and I think perfectionism in relationships is extraordinarily toxic and at the same time extraordinarily valid. For many of us, because we just need to normalize that so many of us have this ideal perfection or perfectionism towards what a relationship should be, what our partner should be.
Yeah, there's a lot of research actually on this in terms of perfectionism in relationships, and so we think perfectionism has three core elements. Self-oriented is a self, one that comes from within. Socially prescribed is the one that comes from outside, so a sense that everyone expects you to be perfect. But there's a third one that's really interesting. It's called other-oriented perfectionism. This is perfectionism that's turned out. What? Other-oriented perfectionism. Other-oriented.
Other-oriented, sorry.
That's right. So it's turned outwards onto other people. So it's kind of like, I suppose, what Freud would call projection, right? The projection of my own onto you. And this is the one that's been studied a lot in relationships. And you find some really interesting stuff around like harmony in terms of relationships, interpersonal conflict, relational conflict, when I expect too much of you and I expect too much of myself. You also see lower sexual satisfaction, difficulties in other difficulties in the bedroom.
Other difficulties. Tell me about those other difficulties. I see you blushing.
Just too much pressure on ourselves to perform, but I'll leave it at that. But you see,
erectile issues. We're adults here. We can talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is stuff we see in the data. You see this come through, and it all comes back to this pressure and intense amount of expectation that we're placing on ourselves to perform all times, and also our partner to perform a certain role all the times. And of course, that I think we think that's the right thing because we want to impress and please, but actually the data is suggesting completely the opposite. That actually can create a lot more disharmony and tension and difficulty.
So is the data suggesting we should be less perfect for our partners?
Well, just more accepting of the reality that people are imperfect, that it's never going to be a perfect. There is no such thing as a perfect relationship. There's always going to be, there's always going to be difficulties. There's always going to be challenges. There's always going to be things that partners do that you that annoy you or piss you off. That's fine. Like the overriding emotion and the thing that carries relationships through is that love. And if you love somebody, that you can tolerate those imperfections, and you can recognize that they're just part and parcel of being a flawed human being, and that's okay. Everybody's flawed. So it goes back to that acceptance piece, right? We talked about it. It's about acceptance and accepting that nobody's perfect, can ever be made perfect, and that's okay. The good outweighs the bad in relationships and the partners that we select, and that's always the most important thing to hold on to.
I appreciate that so much, and I think that's I think it's important if you're listening and you're going, no, like something in me is pushing harder against that of like, no, I need them to be more of. And, it's funny because I was doing a couples therapy session last night. And like, I think part of the challenge sometimes is we feel like there's this idea that's very popular now. You're like, accept, accept, accept. And what happens in that ideology is that we then suppress the impulses to want something different. And that creates its own complication too. And so to normalize both this, everyone is flawed, and as humans, we also might want something different from our partners. We might want more. We might want something better. And both are important to listen to.
Definitely.
It may not be important to share both or okay to share both all the time. But it is important. Like it was a relief for this couple to just be like, I wish you were better at doing the dishes, frankly. And they're like, oh, okay, that's interesting. I wish you were better at communicating your feelings. Yeah, I wish that too. We're both in alignment. And it's not an attack, but it's also like going, in that too, there's like an acknowledgement that you're not perfect. And for them last night, it was really beautiful to be like, you're not perfect. And I still am holding your hand and I love you. Isn't that interesting? Because I'm not suppressing the impulse too.
Yeah, but that also goes back, and it's beautiful. That's a beautiful thing because it's so true. Having open lines of communication about those things are important. What's important, and the perfectionist thing to do would be to be punitive about it.
Yes.
So, do you know what I mean? Like, you aren't very good at this, and therefore you are not a good person. Like, this is that kind of perfectionistic. It makes everything very personal, and that your flaws are part of your characteristic. Whereas accepting that nobody's perfect, we're all imperfect human beings, and showing our vulnerability means that we can acknowledge our flaws, mistakes, and we can talk about those things in other people too, knowing that it comes from a very compassionate place. Actually, it's okay. I recognise it. I've seen it. I'm bringing it up because I know that we can move in a direction that remedies those things, because this is part and parcel of what it means to be human, to make mistakes but also be able to rectify them. So I think the perfectionistic mindset is very rigid, very punitive, and that was why it can come into conflict in relationships and create a lot of disharmony. The acceptance piece is more about not accepting things when they're not good enough, but at the same time being able to accept that it's okay. We can talk about it, and we can come to we can remedy the situation. And I think that's a very different mindset.
Yeah, I really appreciate that unpacking, and like, there's just the way you describe that. It just offers so much more permission to this is obvious, but the permission to not be perfect because we're not. But permission to not be like every moment in the relationship is going to go great, or I am going to mess up. But again, what you're saying is like that the underlying love is the anchor that goes, oh, I messed up. There's some rupture, but there's this underlying base that helps us accept some of those challenges, some of those flaws, some of those ruptures, and even find our way back into relationship when we come out of it.
Yeah, that's the foundation, isn't it? And if that's strong, you never feel like the house is going to tip over, because even though it might teeter, it's always going to maintain its equilibrium because it's held in place by that foundation of love. And I think that, we're getting quite deep now, Scott, but that's what it's all about, fundamentally in terms of relationship. And in the relationships that are close to you and that are strong, that there is that foundation, because you slip up, you can have an open conversation about it, knowing that that's not going to in any way have an impact on the way that you feel about each other, but it is going to have an impact on our behavior moving forward. And that's the crucial distinction, in my mind anyway, having looked back on my own relationships, between relationships that I know are built on a very strong foundation and ones that are not built on that foundation.
Yeah, I think I'm just pausing so that we can all take a moment to think about the relationships where that is there, where there was that permission to actually be I don't like the word flawed personally, but we can use it. I just want to say like the permission to be human.
Mm. Yeah.
And embedded in that is like the absence of perfection. And like when we think back to those relationships where there was that permission, that acceptance, the knowledge that you could not get the A on the test or not say the exact right thing at the exact right time, and they would still be there. Like, I think that's part of what fills that underlying void or that sense of deficit, that like no one's going to catch me or I'm not going to be caught unless it's exact, unless it's perfect.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so true. And I'm sure your listeners can also look back at their own history of relationships, and you can identify the real strong ones are the ones that really give permission to be imperfect, as you say. And that's what it's about in a relationship. Yeah.
Damn. I feel buzzy right now. Like, I'm excited to go like connect back with some of my relationships now and after this and just be like, I really appreciate you. Like, I really appreciate, you don't even know what you've done but you've really allowed for some of that deficit in me to be released just by the fact that you are consistent and no matter how I show up or what I do.
Yeah.
Yeah. My friend Thomas, thank you so much for inspiring us, for guiding us in the beginning or the middle, or definitely not the end of the journey towards resolving our perfectionism. And where can people find you in the world? And where can people get your book?
Oh, that's a very nice invitation. Thank you, Scott, for allowing me to just plug that very quickly. So my book is called The Perfection Trap. It's available in all good bookstores and online. If you just Google The Perfection Trap, Thomas Curran, it will come up as a first hit. And I would encourage listeners, if you do go and read it, I just love to hear from readers, good, bad, or indifferent, or whatever. Please do let me know. I'm always keen to hear your viewpoints, and I will always reply. So please don't be shy. I'd love to hear what you think.
Amazing. And are you on social media if people want to like connect with you there or anywhere else?
I'm not on the main channel social media like Instagram and TikTok, but I do have a LinkedIn account if you'd like to connect there. So again, if you just type in Thomas Curran Perfection Trap, you'll find the LinkedIn through my website. Do connect. Let's connect. Absolutely.
Yeah. And your WhatsApp number is again? I'm just
Social Security.
That's your Social Security. Whatever.
Yeah,
Perfect.
Have it all. No way.
Thomas, thank you for this perfect podcast.
I've enjoyed it. It's been great.
It's been great. And for all those who have listened, thank you so much for tuning in, and we look forward and connect with Thomas on LinkedIn, WhatsApp, through his Social Security number, and especially his book. Thank you all. Thank you for listening to the Gently Used Human podcast with Dr. Scott Lyons and friends. Visit gentlyused.com for fun extras, including submitting your questions for advice from a Midwestern mom. And don't forget to spill the tea and gossip about the show with all your friends and frenemies. And you know what? Show us some love by giving us 5 stars and leaving a review in your favorite apps. This helps us connect with all the other gently used humans out there. Oh, and by the way, you look fierce today.